Salutations, my friends, and welcome again to another episode of Colecast, the podcast for all of us. And I am so excited and stoked and happy for today's episode because this has been an episode like when I first dreamt up this podcast. This is probably one of the very first episodes I envisioned. And today we are going to talk about something near and dear to my heart: professional wrestling. Oh yeah. So, um, for those of you who aren't as familiar with wrestling or pro wrestling, what it is exactly. First of all, I think it's common to get like it misconstrued and thrown in there that it's that wrestling stuff, or God love my wife, but as she will refer to it as idiot theater. But there's so much more to it than that. I mean, pro wrestling to me, it's what drew me into it. It's more than just the athleticism and yes, the storytelling. It's a combination of all of these elements coming together and working and producing and making something that is memorable. I mean, just the history alone of professional wrestling is something that, to me, if you look back at, it's so unique and so unlike anything else out there, really. And I think that's why I find it, or part of it anyway, of what I find so appealing about it. So I want to get right into our discussion here today. And of course, I mentioned the history, and I think that's where we really got to start with. If you look back, I mean, pro wrestling's been around for eons. I mean, literally. I mean, it, the thing that's about pro wrestling is it's literally that battle of good versus evil. I mean, you can go back into biblical times, the Roman times, and look at like that wrestling existed in some format or another. But it's just classic storytelling of of good triumphing evil, and then like the struggle to get there, to defeat that evil, and just I could say the pomp, the circumstance, the pageantry, everything about it is why I love professional wrestling. And I am definitely not the only one. There is millions and the millions out there just as crazy and nutty as me. So if you look at the evolution of pro wrestling, you got to go look back, really, at least here in North America, into the old carny days. So, the carnival would come to down, and it'd be like, oh, I'll pay you 10 cents if you can wrestle this polar bear or some shit like that. Okay, maybe not a polar bear, a grizzly bear. Whatever. You get my idea. You get the drift. But it was kind of like a sideshow attraction, really. And that kind of evolved into its own thing because if you think about it, it goes into, we're talking like grappling with some of the forefathers of wrestling, like Frank Gotch, George Hackenschmidt, all the shooter style, if you will. And that's really kind of where it turned from that carnival thing into more of an athletic sport. And it was an athletic, and it still is, damn it. Let me just say that. But more of an athletic focus, like sporting event for people to go to. And you got to keep in mind, too, wrestling drew more than like back in the day, and I'm talking early 1900s, than like baseball and like basketball and even football in its infancy. I mean that I mentioned those two gentlemen, Hackenschmidt and Gotch. I mean, those guys drew a shit ton of people in Chicago. Um, I don't know the exact figure, but I mean it was astronomical in those days. And then from there, you really go into like the 20s. and I would say, and the shooter style is still predominant. And by the way, what I mean by the shooter is pretty much is a grappling style, a wrestler who pulls or holds no punches, or if you will, more of a hard ass style, if you will. Hard ass, that kind of sounds weird, but you get what I'm saying. um, so you got so you pretty much have got like what really kind of took pro wrestling to the infancy of what we really have come to know now is you got to give credit where credit is due, and I would say that really would be the what is referred to as the Gold Dust Trio. Now I'm talking about Ed the Strangler Lewis, Billy Sandow, and Toots Mondt. And what these guys would do is they would pretty much work together. And and this is where a lot of wrestling terminology came from, such as like a work, shooter, kayfabe, all that. Um, but they pretty much kind of worked together and just kind of kept the main attraction, which would have been the championship belt, um, within house, if you will. And then that's kind of really where kind of people started to smarten up to it and be like, hey, something's going on here, you know? I mean, granted, pro wrestling, um, well, like I said, it was viewed more of as a sport then. And then into the before it was really a entertainment aspect of it was really looked at. So, anyways, you go from that era, which really kind of changed the industry, to now you get into like the 1950s, and this is an era where you really have guys like Luthez and Fern Gagne come along, and then as far as when you get to the television getting introduced, which by the way, man, television and pro wrestling, they were just like made for each other. I'm telling you. But you get into that era, and you're talking about that now. You have character development, and the first guy to really like have a character that was, I would say, memorable is Gorgeous George, where Gorgeous George would come out to the ring flamboyant, and he'd be wearing his robes, and he would have earrings on, and he would take the earrings and throw them out to the crowd. That's really where a lot of that the sports entertainment really kind of in a way got started. Definitely, Gorgeous George was a huge pioneer, and a lot of professional wrestlers have emulated him over the years, for sure. And so you've got that, and then at this point, really, it just is like growing like rapid fire, and that's when you get the introduction of the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, and this is where you have territories. So you've got territories all throughout, not only the United States, but I mean you've got in other areas too uh, of North America, and of course, I mean overseas as well, and we'll get to that. But um, when you look at some of these territories, man, back in the day, they all there's some really big names and some really interesting, like where these guys come from. I mean, I'm just going to name drop some few here. Here out in California, you had the WWA or the NWA Hollywood, which that was predominantly uh, classy Freddie Blassie. You've got out there as well, of course, the Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, the original Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, um, who, as he would say, couldn't happen to a nicer guy. What was his little catchphrase there? A little trivia for you, if you will. You have Pacific Northwest was in like the Portland, Washington area. And you had guys like I believe Pat Patterson was in that area for a while. Of course, and then Minneapolis. We're gonna go across all over the board here. Um, we got, of course, the AWA in Minneapolis, founded by Fern Gagne. St. Louis still is a huge wrestling town with the names of like Luthez and Harley Race. Texas is another big one with world class wrestling. Of course, the Funk Brothers. Big shout out to Indy here. We're talking about the WWA, which was ran by Dick the Bruiser, which any wrestling fan here in the state of Indiana knows, like Dick the Bruiser's our guy. Go up to Michigan. You got big time wrestling ran by the Sheik in Detroit. And of course, we can't forget about Tennessee, Memphis area, USWA, Continental, with Jerry Lawler and the Jarretts running that. Cannot forget about Mid South Wrestling with Bill Watts running out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then, of course, you've got Georgia Championship Wrestling and Championship Wrestling out of Florida, and Mid Atlantic out of the Carolinas, ran by the Crockett's. And, of course, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation ran out of New York by one Vince McMahon Sr. We'll get to Junior here in a minute, but Senior. So yeah, the territories, man, and the cool thing was, so you had your one heavyweight champion who was the NWA champion, and he would go to each one of these territories and would defend his title against the top stars in that territory. And the championship used to be decided by, like, there was like a committee, a board, if you will, that would decide who would be champion, who would be the face of the company, and be guys who obviously could draw big money to all these different towns. And it'd be cool. You'd have the champion come in and work with the top talent in that territory, and um, you know, it's the classics. It's a great saying here in wrestling about the getting over, and then the loser got over, so to speak. So, um, if you know, you know. So, anyways, so that's just so that's kind of the evolution there of what happened as far as the territories. And then something else we gotta touch upon is there's different styles in pro wrestling still to this day. And of course, here in the U.S., I would say it's a combination of different things, from grappling to high flying to submission. And you've got different wrestlers who specialize in those styles. And of course, you've got the Puerto Rico was a big area run by Carlos Colon. That was often more so known for a lot more of violence, if you will. And then, of course, we got to talk about the Polynesians, with High Chief Peter Maifia and that family bloodline. My God, I mean, you talk about, I don't there is no other family that's produced that many successful wrestlers. I mean, you're talking about guys like Alpha and Sika, the Wild Samoans. You're talking about later on Yokozuna, Rikishi, Samu, the Tongan Kid, aka Haku, and of course the jabroni beating, pie eating, The Rock come from that family, uh, and so many others too. Later on, like Umanga, the Uso brothers, and of course now Roman Reigns. And I'm leaving out a lot of names there, but my God, it just goes on and on. But yeah, so the Polynesians, they're in Hawaii, that area. Also, of course, in Mexico, it's a love affair with Lucha Libre, um, which is a definitely a high flying style of pro wrestling. When I say high flying, come off the top rope and doing flips and all sorts of crazy good stuff. But the mask is a huge thing there. A lot of the wrestlers wear masks, and um, that is a big part of that culture. And if we're going overseas, the European style is more of a submission-based grappling style of wrestling. And then, of course, my favorite, Japanese or the Puroso style of wrestling. And I know I butchered that. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Okay, whatever. Anyways, so yeah, that's the different styles, and Japanese style is really a mixture of like submission with just strong style. It gets referred to a lot of it's just a lot stiffer, a lot more a realistic style of professional wrestling. Um, but yeah, so that kind of gives you a little layout of the evolution of where we got to, and then of course the 1980s come along, and that is when the game really changes because of, I got to give the devil his due, one Vincent Kennedy Mcmahon. Vince Jr. comes along, takes over the WWF at the time from his dad, rebrands it to the World Wrestling Federation, and as they say, the rest is history. Who doesn't remember that from the 80s? All right. So, anyways, Vince McMahon comes along and really changes things to where pretty much he starts handpicking the top talents out of the different territories and putting them in his WWF. And of course, this pisses off a lot of the territories and the promoters, and rightfully so, because they're taking their talent away, and he's offering them big time money. And of course, too, you got to keep in mind too. Also, at this time, at this point, cable TV is starting to come around, and once again, that marriage between pro wrestling and television is just they were meant for each other. Now, while Vince McMahon's growing his empire, you also have the other promotions are still going strong. Like you had World Class Championship Wrestling out of Texas was really innovated, and I don't think gets enough credit for the style they adapted as far as like making it so pleasing to the eye as far as watching on television. And there's a lot of elements, camera shots, music, I believe too, because of the Freebirds, Fabulous Freebirds, really was the first to introduce music, which is, my God, that's such a huge part of a professional wrestler now is just their entrance music. I mean, that's a huge part of a character development. Um, but yeah, World Class was still going. You had Crockett Promotions was still going, and really Crockett was kind of what ended up being the competitor to the WWF. And really, a lot of that has to do with the spot they had on TBS, 6:05 Saturday nights. So yeah, so there in the 80s, it just kind of becomes a really a war between the WWF and the uh, what's left really of the NWA. Now the AWA was also still around at this point, but they were just kind of late to the game. In all honesty, man. And you still had territories going strong too, in a sense of like definitely Continental was going pretty good still with Jerry Lawler, and they had an amazing storyline there in the early part of the 80s with Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler. But we won't get into that. But yeah, man. So you've got the WWF really is just like, and where Fence was smart about this was each one of these wrestlers had like a different, unique character, and it was marketable to children. And that's where I come in as far as my introduction to pro wrestling. And it wasn't so much like the actual wrestling. Nope. It was this right here. And we talked about this on our last episode of Colecast on Saturday Morning Cartoons, which is available now on Spotify and other podcast providers. But talking about a little bit of Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. This theme still gets me, dude. Yeah, so for me, it was just like, oh, okay, I'm gonna watch this cartoon. And I remember my parents got me like the Hulk Hogan doll, like the old school, like I think it was like a 16-inch, like not really posable doll, and with the red shirt and the yellow tights, of course. So that was kind of like my first introduction into pro wrestling. That kind of got me interested into it. Now, granted, I didn't really start watching it till the latter years when I was old enough to realize it. But I mean, the WWF in the '80s into the '90s, they just took it really next level into mainstream, and a lot of that, of course, you have to. As much as I really don't care for him, you have to give credit to a lot of talent, and he's not the only one. But I mean, Hulk Hogan was the big draw. Let's call a spade a spade. He's a big part of the appeal of what put butts in seats. I mean, my God, he was on a cover, the first pro wrestler, and maybe one of the only on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I'm sure there's probably been somebody else on there, but that's nothing's coming to mind. But anyways, I mean, Hulk Hogan, his name was synonymous as say that 3 times fast, kid. But no, Hulk Hogan he was the face, man. Um, and then of course you've got where Vince really takes a huge gamble and does the first WrestleMania. And they bring in a lot of celebrities that really kind of help popularize it, and also working with MTV at the time too, and that generation just made it all the more appealing. Working with celebrities like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, and so on. And that first WrestleMania was a huge, huge success. And then who can forget, fast forward a couple years later to WrestleMania 3, where Hogan faces Andre the Giant, and Andre the Giant easily at this point was probably the biggest draw. I mean, Andre was the first real wrestler to come along that didn't need a title. He didn't need a championship. It was just his name, his presence, and rightfully so. I mean, literally, the man's larger than life. Um, so yeah, that big matchup at Pontiac Silverstone in WrestleMania 3 that drew 93,000. 173, I think. Of course, that number is disputable, but we're not going to get into that. But anyways, I mean that really, really put it on the map, man. I mean to draw that many people, regardless if that's legit the number or not, still it was a shit ton of people. And when you've got like backed up traffic for hours on end just to get into the damn arena, I mean that speaks volumes. But yeah, anyways, Vince, so those are some monumental moments there. And then marketed a lot towards kids. I mean, it just went hand in hand. I mean, you had the toys, you had, of course, I mentioned Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling, the cartoon. You had they were just licensed on all sorts of things, like everything from freaking ice cream bars to, of course, apparel. Video games was a huge part of it. I mean, they had freaking WWF comic books back in the day. Um, I mean, you name it. It was like it was a part of pop culture, man. Now, so I mentioned for me, like I didn't really come around to it until a little bit later in life. And I kind of came into really watching wrestling in a very odd time. It was about 1993. And if you're a pro wrestling fan, that time frame really, there's not really a whole lot of good things going on, um, kind of a down year, if you will, for WWF. And by the way, at this point, NWA had become WCW. Ted Turner pretty much owns it. If you know, you know. So sorry I backtracked there for a minute. But anyways, I digress. Because remember, I tend to do that a lot. But this is Colecast. And remember on Colecast, kids, we do whatever the fuck we want. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Anyways, so 93. I'm a little guy. And I can remember it very distinctly. I go with my mom I'm running errands with my mom, and she goes to what at the time was Cardinal Cable Company, which is essentially ended up becoming Xfinity or Comcast Xfinity, whatever the fuck they're calling it now. Um, but anyways, I can remember going in there, and at the time, like we go in and she went to go pay the bill, and they had a little lobby there that had like some stuff on stand, like kind of TV guides, if you will, or pamphlets, literature on like, oh, this is what's coming up on HBO and Showtime and the Disney Channel and all this other shit. Well, there I see Hulk Hogan and some other wrestlers, and some of them I don't really recognize, on a cover of what ultimately was a WrestleMania 9 program, which, by the way, I mentioned 93 sucked, and WrestleMania 9 is probably the worst WrestleMania of all time. But I just remember seeing this program there, and the lady was at the register or whatever you want to call it, was just like, "Yeah, go ahead, take one of those." So I took it home with me. And I remember just reading through it and like being enamored with like these larger than life characters and looking at the imagery and the stories being told about like like how Bret Hart was a fighting champion against Yokozuna and how Hulk Hogan was coming back out of retirement essentially to help out his friend Brutus the Barber Beefcake against the Money Incorporated, and Lex Luger's been on a tear and going to take on Mr. Perfect and all this other shit. Crush and Doink the Clown. That was an intimidating feud as a kid. But anyways, so yeah, I can remember uh, getting that program, and I remember taking cutting up the pictures in the magazine and hanging them on my wall like posters. And then fast forward to several months later, and I'm channel surfing, and there we go. I see a ring with a shit ton of wrestlers in it. And at the time, I didn't know this, but there was a battle royal. And this was the battle royal they held on an episode of Monday Night Raw in October-ish of 93, where it was to declare the new Intercontinental Champion. And it ended up coming down to the final two was Razor Ramon and Rick the Model Martel. And that the match ended there because it was set up like the last two competitors would wrestle the next week. And as a kid, I was always confused on battle royals because this was the first one I ever seen. And I thought like, okay, it's like two guys get down to two, and then they have a wrestling match. And obviously, that's not how it works. It's just whoever the last man standing is. But anyways, and from there, man, pretty much I was hooked. I was just like, all right, I need this in my life. I'm gonna start watching every week, and I'm at this time too. I'm also watching WCW too, um, which I enjoyed like watching. Keep in mind this is 93, 94. I'm coming in watching guys like Ric Flair and Sting and Big Fan Veda, one of the greatest big men of all time. Of all time. So yeah, I'm watching that and the WWF. I'm watching both products. Um, and I'm getting really into them. I'm watching them, and I can remember. This is a couple of years later. Like now, I'm getting like obsessed with it, right? And I remember I was so excited because my dad went out and got us tickets to see my first wrestling show. And you know what that was, kiddos? I'm going to tell you. It was actually a pay-per-view in Indianapolis, October of 96, WWF Buried Alive. That's right. And this was like a blow-off storyline between The Undertaker and Mankind. And it was a what they called a buried alive match, and it was the whole point of it. You didn't pin your opponent, you didn't beat the shit out of him until like he can't go. No, you literally put him in a fucking grave and would bury his ass, right? So as a kid, you're like, oh fuck, the shit's going down for real, right? But anyways, I can remember we had perfect seats, dude, and it was like because it was like right high above the burial site, if you will, and then you could still see have a perfect view of the ring as well, right? And I can just remember getting to see like the action, just perfect. My dad couldn't have done any better, and that was the first wrestling event I ever saw, man. And this, like that match ended with the Undertaker ultimately won, but then all the bad guy wrestlers come out and beat the shit out of him for no reason other than they're bad guy wrestlers, and they're like, "Fuck you." But anyways, so they come out and beat the shit out of the Undertaker. They throw him in the grave, and then they bury him alive. And then the lights dim, and then there's like lightning going on in the arena, and then some thunder somehow miraculously strikes the gravesite, and then you see the Undertaker's hand come up on the ground, and that was it. I'm hooked. And that's crazy. That was my first event, and like I'd go to several others as a kid, like independent shows, and it was just like, oh, fuck, it's not the same. I was a spoiled little shit when it came to that. But that was my first pro wrestling show. Was that Buried Alive, man, and it was great. Now, and that was a time frame too, really, where you have like the industry just is starting to change, kind of going into more so of a reality base. But also at this time too, you got to keep in mind the Monday Night Wars is going on. That's right. As Monday Night Raw come on in '93, but WCW introduced their Monday night show in '95 called WCW Nitro. And Nitro, the difference was back then, WWF used to tape their shows, right? They'd sometimes have some live ones, but mostly it was taped. Well, anyways, WCW, they actually would go live for their shows, right? And that was like a huge advantage, really, in the fact that there's just something more magical about live professional wrestling than something that's taped, I think, to me. And Nitro really kind of brought that to the forefront in the sense of like anything can happen because on their very first show, Lex Luger showed up, who at the time was well, he wasn't technically a WWF contracted wrestler, but he just literally came from WWF. I mean, my God, the man was involved in an angle of a major pay per view literally a week before he debuts on Nitro. So, yeah, and Nitro kind of become the show like you had to start watching. And this is the first time where WWF's really got to like kind of pump the brakes. And it's like, oh fuck, this is legit competition. So, and everybody, you as a kid, you were torn. Like, what do I watch, Nitro or Raw? And I can remember what I'd do back in the day is like I would record one and on a VHS, and then the other one I would watch live. So, uh, with W with Nitro, man, it was just like anything can happen. I mean, stuff happened like that with the Luger, and then who can forget Medusa showing up on Nitro and taking the WWF Women's Belt and throwing it in the garbage. Um, and of course, you have to talk about the birth of the NWO, New World Order, which that really put it in a reality base where it was like, oh shit, these guys from WWF, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, are coming to WCW to take over. And the way they booked that angle, that beginning, man, was so genius. And that's really kind of where the tides was starting to turn. And then it was like the NWO come out and like sneak attack the WCW wrestlers, and it just become like them versus the world, so to speak. Um, and it was so weird because at this time too, traditionally, like you're cheering for the good guys and booing for the bad guys, but like the NWO was bad guys, but you found yourself like liking them, you know. Um, so we go pretty much, and WCW starts just kicking their ass every week in the ratings and stuff. It gets so bad to a point where it WWF came very close to shutting down, man. But then the it started to get more edgier product, and you had the birth of the Attitude Era, which we all love. Um, so the Attitude Era, I mean, you can define it as like several different like time frames for when it started. I mean, I would say kind of 97 is really when it started. Um, and you had like more edgier promos, more, a little bit more violence in the ring. And of course, this man here, Mr. Stone Cold Steve Austin, who everybody fucking loved, and who was probably the most over wrestler, period. I mean, my God, the dude fucking was just a he was at the he was the face of wrestling at a time that needed he was the perfect face for it. But the Attitude Era comes along, it's getting more realistic, and part of this is because of the competition from WCW, but let's also not forget, also at this time frame, you have got a promotion that's really getting a lot of notoriety, if you will. And that, my friends, is a little something we call ECFNW, baby. Extreme Championship Wrestling. So ECW was like it was like the rock star alternative, just like something completely different than typical storytell wrestling. A hell of a lot more realistic, a lot more adult content. And I feel like I grew up in the perfect time frame because this is when I was starting to become a teenager, and those things are starting to interest me, if you will, of like different uh, elements. Let's put it that way. But yeah, so ECW comes along, man, and God, man, they have such a great roster of talent of guys like Tommy Dreamer, Raven, Taz, Sabu, Rob Van Dam, the franchise Shane Douglas, the Dudley Boys. The list goes on and on, folks. Just a more realistic, based, and also long term storytelling too, which my God is missing from the WWE product currently at the moment. But we're not going to talk about that. We're talking about the history here and the where we're going and where it was and where it's went. So yeah, the Attitude Era. So you have this kind of like fuck the authority, like fuck the man. We're gonna do what we want to do. The anti-hero, if you will, and it was definitely Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin was definitely the face of that. And then I think also too, you got to attribute as terrible of a situation as it was, the Montreal Screwjob, as it's referred to, is really kind of a big turn of the Attitude Era as well, when Bret Hart was literally screwed, and the planned finish was supposed to be like a smudge, like bullshit draw with him and Shawn Michaels in Survivor Series '97, and that ended up not being the case. And they put the belt on Shawn, and well, if you're a wrestling fan, you know the rest is history. But yeah, that's really kind of what brought on the Attitude Era. Really was a couple of those things, I would say. And then you have the wars going on, and at this point with the Attitude Era, it's just start kicking the shit out of WCW. Because I mean, the NWO storyline worked for a while, but then it just got redundant, especially when you had like a million people as part of that group. Whereas I could turn over on WWF, and I'm watching Steve Austin stun Vince McMahon. I'm watching D-Generation X giving crotch chops to the crowd. I'm seeing some bizarre shit like Foul Phoenix getting his pee chopped off. Yeah, it's just amazing to me how like the WWF, like how the character development over the years. Where as a kid, it was like I had law enforcement man, like the Big Boss Man and the Mountie, and I had the $1 Million Man was a rich guy. Into the Attitude Era, you had characters like a pimp in The Godfather and a porn star in Foul Phoenix. But that was what was great about the Attitude Era, man. You just it was in your face. It was No punches hold back, you know. Uh, so at this point, pretty much WCW goes to the shits. Um, as you get 90, we're talking 98 and 99 and 2000. And finally, WWF is just rolling on all cylinders. That's the place where everybody wants to be, and rightfully so. And that's what everybody's watching. And then come circa 2001, WCW goes out of business, and thus the war ends. Also, unfortunately, at that time, ECW ended as well. Not so much because of the fan base or notoriety; it just ended just because they ran out of money. Um, so yeah, and then at this point, you go. So now you've got the WWF's the winner of the war, the main company to work for, and it's just like they're what do you do, you know? Like and then they kind of transcended the attitude era goes into the ruthless aggression era. Okay. And this is where you see like guys still left over from the attitude era kind of slowly transition out of the business. All right. And now you've got up and comers like a John Cena or also, you've got, like Randy Orton, Batista, Brock Lesnar, those guys. And also, too, you've got at this point guys who are just great in ring talents who finally get their due, like Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, those guys. And this is where it gets tough for me, man. So I'm still watching wrestling at this point. Um, I went a couple years from like around that 2002 era. I kind of stopped watching, and then like I heard about Brock Lesnar, and I was like, okay, I gotta check this guy out. And then I saw and then my guy, and like I say, this is where it gets tough. My favorite wrestler of all time was Chris Benoit, and I was rooting for him so hard. And then my God, WrestleMania 20, it finally happens. Chris Benoit in the main event wins the world title. And at the same time, too, Eddie Guerrero is the WWE champion. And they just have this beautiful moment in the ring, which I still, to this day, I think is a magical moment. It was a great time in wrestling. It's just really unfortunate what would happen years later with Chris Benoit and that tragedy with his family. And that kind of, when that happens, I'm devastated because my favorite wrestler here has done something just unforgivable. So at this point, I'm not really watching the business. I mean, I kind of hear flickerings of it here and there, and I mean, I tell you what kept me kind of still somewhat interested into it was actually TNA wrestling and Ring of Honor. Were the two promotions, but mainly I would say first Ring of Honor because that's where I start seeing guys like Samoa Joe, CM Punk, Brian Danielson, Homicide, just to name a few, Austin Aries, and it's like, oh man, this is pretty good, man. This is like ECW, only not as storyline driven. It's just good in ring competition, and a lot of those guys would go over and work in TNA, and TNA was kind of a mixture of uh, those guys along with just talents that didn't necessarily make it for whatever reason in the WWF. Um, yeah, I wouldn't say that. Let me take those words back. They just I don't know, they just ended up working out better in TNA, let's put it that way. So, yeah, so I'm kind of on again, off again watching it. And then from there, WWF or I'm sorry, at this point, I got to stop calling them WWF, right? It's WWE. But then the WWE, which that happened all the way back in '01, I think, at the end of '01, and '02, whatever, is when that changed, which really was because the World Wildlife Fund won a lawsuit with them, regardless of what WWE would say. But anyways, I digress. I'm sorry, guys. But you go into the PG era of WWE, and There's some decent wrestling, I guess, but I gotta be honest with you, man. To me, it looked like it was the drizzling shits. Just wasn't for me. It just didn't really appeal to me. So at this point, I'm not really watching wrestling. And then something comes along that really grabs my eye. That is WWE's developmental system, NXT. And this, I'm like, holy shit. Like, this is good in-ring action, decent storytelling, and it's new, fresh faces. Along with mixed with some guys, that work the indies, because I always respect and love the indies. Um, but yeah, so NXT, and with that, NXT comes along the woman's evolution. Because women in pro wrestling had always been, I hate to say it, but kind of just an afterthought, or kind of put in like just ridiculous, shitty, stupid fucking roles, man. Like when I was a kid or a teenager, it was like bra and panty matches, and they were just idolized for their like bodies and not so much for their in ring work. And it was never thought of like, oh, the girls can go just as well as the guys. But shit, man. You had the and let me backtrack here first and say like women's wrestling has always been great, and it just depends on where you watch it at. Because years later, I would really discover my God, man, Joshi wrestling or women's Japanese wrestling. Holy shit, man, and that was so ahead of its time. So it's like finally making its way really here to America, as you got girls that just can go, and yeah, they look good too, but still it's about character development, and it's about in-ring storytelling and psychology. And with NXT, you had the introduction of wrestlers like Paige, and of course the Four Horsewomen, Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, Bailey, Becky Lynch. Um, so those females come in really and change the game, man. And I tell you, so like that got me interested. But the one match that brought me right back into it was Takeover Brooklyn, Sasha Banks versus Bailey for the women's championship. Holy shit. That match is incredible. If you've never seen it, go watch it on the shitty fucking Peacock network. That's right, I said it. Go fuck yourself, Peacock. You're shit. I don't like you. And I'm not the only one. But yeah, great. Yeah, that match got me hooked, man. And it was like, okay, I'm back into it. But I'm only really watching the NXT product. I'm not really watching the main roster products. I mean, yeah, I would come around, and yes, I would watch stuff like, I would watch the, oh, um, WrestleManias and the big pay per views like that, but it just wasn't the same, man. Then what really gets my attention is New Japan Pro Wrestling starts to become more well known in North America, and kind of what brought that into it was Wrestle Kingdom 9. Or no, it may have been 8. It was the second Okada Tanahashi match. But anyways, they partner up with Jeff Jarrett's Global Championship Wrestling and put on a pay-per-view available in North America, and Wrestle Kingdom. And my God, Wrestle Kingdom is the equivalent of WrestleMania in Japan, pretty much. But it's got like all the pomp, all the circumstance. It's got all the like the arena is just like huge there. It's in the Tokyo Dome, which is a world-renowned arena. And oh my God, I was just like, holy shit, this is fucking awesome. This is like what wrestling should be. So then I start watching the New Japan product, man, and I'm getting hooked. I'm getting introduced to all these great Japanese wrestlers like Shinsuke Nakamura, who you just heard there, along with Kazuchika Okada, Hiroshi Tanahashi, Togi Makabe, Minoru Suzuki, and Tomohiro Ishii, and the list just goes on and on. And I'm getting so, because this is the wrestling's always embedded in me, right, guys? And this is where the obsessive compulsive disorder comes over, and it's like I gotta get all this content, because there was tape training back in my day, but it was just like, I as a kid, it was just like you didn't really I knew about stuff over in Japan, but I didn't really truly discover it or appreciate it until my latter adult years. And this is, thank God, a lot to YouTube. Just going in and watching YouTube and watching not only New Japan, but my God, Old Japan Pro Wrestling. If I was watching that shit in the 90s, man, I would have been fucking hooked. I mean, my God, the Four Pillars, Mitsuharu Misawa, Kento Kobashi. Oh my God, just go if you get a chance, man, and you love wrestling, just YouTube some Old Japan Pro Wrestling from the 90s. Holy shit. It'll rock your world. So, yeah, man. So, I'm at this point, I'm like really watching this, and then I start, and the cool thing about New Japan at this point is, yeah, it's a mixture of Japanese talent, but a lot of talent from North America. Guys who work on the indies and Ring of Honor. And this is where I really first discover like the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega. And then they bring over a big name like AJ Styles. And of course, the Bullet Club, man. I mean, my God, the Bullet Club was the shit. It still is to this day. Um, so yeah, it's like, dude, I'm coming back full circle. I'm fucking hooked, brother. So, then you've got, like, where those guys are so popular, and a lot of it has to do with the way those guys promoted themselves, like, you gotta give credit to Nick and Matt Jackson, man, with their YouTube show Being the Elite. That really kinda resonated and, brought in a new crowd, and so those guys team up with Cody Rhodes, and they pretty much bet on themselves. And they put on their first like big arena, over 10,000 people arena show in All In, bringing in all sorts of different talents from different promotions and stuff to do, and would end up doing a pay-per-view, and it just was huge. And then you've got, so like where the purist wrestlers, man, they're like they're looking at this and seeing this, and they're like, oh man, this is holy shit, this is something. And then you had like a guy like Chris Jericho, who was a WWE guy, forever go work in New Japan and pop up and work with Kenny Omega because he's the best bout machine. And my God, it's just, and there's some incredible stories there in New Japan told too. I absolutely adore the story of Tetsuya Naito. My God, if you look at that story, like that could be a whole podcast episode unto itself, man. Just an incredible story. And that was the great thing too, that I love about New Japan is it's long-term storytelling. It's not bullshit where it's like we just got to get it out there and just like, okay, here it is, kids. They're gonna fight at the next pay-per-view just because. Um, so yeah, that comes along, and my God, I'm just like New Japan, watching a lot of independent wrestling, watching Ring of Honor, and then next thing you know, oh yeah, the birth of All Elite Wrestling, AEW. Which, if you guys follow me, I'm a huge fucking AEW mark, and I will say that loud and I will say that proud. I've been watching that promotion from day fucking one, and rightfully so, man. Like, and yes, there's WWE marks out there or whatever, and there's a lot of it's now a bitch fest between the two fan bases, but just fucking love it, man, because it's pro wrestling. But yeah, so AEW, the birth of AEW, that's when it's just like, okay, I'm back full blown into this. I'm tuning in. I'm watching like when their first pay-per-view, Double or Nothing, and then checking out like their YouTube, or they were on not YouTube, it was on was it Bleacher Report or something? Those specials like the Fight for the Fallen and stuff like that. And then the first Dynamite comes on, and then wrestling returns to TNT. It's like, man, you talk about shit coming full circle. So, Yeah, and now it's just a resurgence. The business right now is just an all-time like healthiness as far as I'm concerned, and AEW is killing it, man. It's my God, it's amazing to see how far they've come along in a mere 2 years. But here's the one thing I love about AEW is how they don't the number one, they let the wrestlers do their job because that's what's really a big turnoff for me with WWE anyway is how it's so scripted and so it's not authentic. Like if you wanted like an authentic moment in WWE over the past I'd say 5 to 10 years, Wrestlemania, this past one, what was it, 37, where the beginning of it's live and they have a rain delay and they like just have the wrestlers come in and cut promos. That shit worked, man. Let them be them. Don't like just don't over scrutinize it and shit. But anyways, we're not talking about WWE. We're talking about pro wrestling. And with AEW, what I love about them is how they were working with other promotions and it's creating a healthy environment. And right now, folks, we are in a time where we're talking about my God, you've got it's so healthy right now because you have guys like um or I'm sorry, not guys. You have promotions that are just working with AEW promotions like the NWA, brought back by the great musician Mr. One Billy Corgan. They're working with they worked with GCW Game Changer Wrestling with bringing in Nick fucking Gage, working with New Japan Pro Wrestling, working with Impact Wrestling. And you've also got other promotions out there like Ring of Honor still going strong, Major League Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. The list just goes on and on and on. And it's really kind of the closest we're going to see it back with territories. And the beautiful thing is in this day and age, everybody's got access to this. So, I mean, it's fucking great, man. It's the business is the healthiest it's been in a long time, and I'm so happy to be back into this world and watching it again, and I can't wait to see where it goes from next. And I mean, my God, AEW is just killing it right now, and like the turning point really. I was so proud. I hate to say I seen it come, but I knew was All Out in Chicago. And if you guys follow me, on Cold TV, we've got a whole series of vlogs on that weekend. And like I say in those vlogs, man, that was a once in a lifetime experience. I mean, I've seen a lot of different events and wrestling shows, and now that it's been about over a month or close to a month since I've been, but my God, that 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 weekend, I'm gonna remember that for the rest of my life. It was so amazing, and it was so cool being around fellow wrestling fans, as this was something we've just been clamoring for. Uh, man, it was once again, it was just a once in a lifetime experience. Pro wrestling is back, and it's healthier than it's ever been. So that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and conclude this episode of Coldcast. And trust me, it has more topics to get into, but we will talk about at a later day, like my baker's dozens of my favorite wrestlers of all time, But like I say, man, I hope for anybody that's a non-wrestling fan, just give it a chance, man. Check it out. Watch All Elite Wrestling. They're on Wednesday nights and Friday nights on TNT. That's getting ready to change in January. They'll go over to TBS on Wednesday nights, but still be on TNT on Fridays. But yeah, man, it's just I don't know. There's just something magical. If you're in the pro wrestling community, you just know, man. It's the fan base is just incredible. They're compassionate. They've been watching this for years. It's all about like the long term storytelling of seeing something happen. And once again, it goes back to talking about good versus evil, and then this good triumphing, but the struggle of getting there. Um, and then just every little element added into it, from the entrance to the wrestler's moveset to the psychology told into the match to the end result. And I got to tell you, during COVID era, one thing that was missing tremendously was the fans. But the fans are a massive part of what makes pro wrestling so magical, in my opinion. And being part of that crowd there in Chicago, my God, that was just insane, off the charts. People I didn't even know, but we were all on the same wave level, if you will. So, like I say, man, wrestling, it's kind of one of those things, you either love it or you hate it. And for me, I absolutely love it. It's good shit, man. So, that being said, as Kenny Omega would say, I must bid you adieu. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Colecast as we've talked about the world of professional wrestling. And trust me, folks, there's going to be plenty more podcast episodes down the line that we're going to talk about aspects of wrestling. But I mainly wanted to get this one out there, so we could kind of just get the ground covered, if you will. So, I'm Jeremy, aka XLJ the OG, and you've been listening to Colecast, the podcast for all of us. Take care, and I'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.